Welcome to the Strength for the Day podcast, which is a daily Bible study with Dennis Fountain. We hope this time together will be challenging, sharpening, uplifting, encouraging, and strengthening to your Christian walk. Thank you for joining us, and we pray you are helped through today's study.
Welcome to Strength for the Day as we continue a study in the book of Esther. And I hope that the study's been an encouragement and a help to you as we come back to our time this morning. I realize that I've been kind of giving the story each and every day as we begin, but I really feel that helps. It helps us to understand the context and the content that we are going to discover. And so I don't mean to be repetitive if for those of you that have been every day in the study of Esther, but remember, King Ahasuerus is the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. The children of Israel at this time are in captivity. Many of them are living in Shushan or Susa, the palace, this palace area for the Medo-Persian Empire. Two of those individuals who are of Hebrew descent that are living there are Mordecai and his cousin Hadassah or Esther. And through the course of events, Ahasuerus ends up choosing Esther as a wife, and God would use this situation to preserve his people. Here's why. Mordecai was a servant in the king's gate that would be serving within the palace. Haman was a man who was second in command. It was Ahasuerus, and then Haman would be a second in command position. One of the chief princes is what he would be called. Well, because of his title and because of his position, most of the people were commanded to bow to him, but Mordecai would not bow to him. To bow means, in this context, it meant to worship as a god, to attribute that kind of godship to that position. And someone asked Mordecai, "Why don't you bow?" And he said, "Because I'm a Jew. I only worship God alone. I am not going to bow before this man. I'm not going to say that he is a god because there's only one God." And all of that could be inferred by him using that phrase, "because I am a Jew." And so because of that, Haman gets this bitterness and hatred toward Mordecai. Well, Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther has opportunity to go before the king. Remember, she's scared too, but Mordecai says to her, "You never know. This could be the reason that God has you in the position he has you in for such a time as this." Esther builds up the courage. She goes before the king. And again, through the course of events, the truth comes out. And we closed off our episode yesterday seeing Haman being hung from the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And God taking that revenge on the enemy of God and the enemy of God's people. But we really looked yesterday at what bitterness can do to a life. And so now that doesn't undo what Haman had already done. In the Medo-Persian Empire, there was this rule that if the king said it and put it in writing, then the people had to follow it, and the king could not even reverse what he had said. So that's where we're at. The Jews are supposed to die on a certain day of a certain month. It uses the month of Nisan and Adar. These 2 months, now we probably would say maybe March and April, but both kind of overlap March and April. And so it's that time that the Jews are supposed to be killed. And here's what we read in verse number 1 of chapter number 8 in the book of Esther. It says this: "And on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews." So now Mordecai receives the position of Haman. Esther's begging for the king to do something. Verse 4. "And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, 'If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the things seem right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, to the satraps, to the governors, to the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in his own script, to every province, or to their people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of the king Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan the citadel. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So chapter 8 is really kind of the, not the climax, because that will take place in chapter number 9, but it's everything's kind of coming to a head. What we find, of course, is these decrees to kill the Jews are now being reversed. Now, they're not being reversed in the sense that the king sent out and says, all right, don't do that, because that can't be done. But the king does send out word and says, every Jew has a right to defend themselves, and if someone comes to kill them, they can defend themselves and attack back, and then they can take the possessions of the person that came to slaughter them. And so when you look at this passage and we look at everything taking place, the question might be, okay, what could we get from Esther chapter number 8 that could help us? And here's what I simply want to point out today in the next minute and a half. I want to point out this simple fact, that God promises to work good in the life of his people. Now, that does not mean that God will always protect from evil forces, that God will always preserve life. That doesn't mean that. Now, the Bible says in Romans chapter 8 and verse number 28 that we can know that everything will work together for good to them who are the called, to them who love God according to his purpose. And we can go and you can read Romans chapter 8, verse 28 and 29. And here's what we can understand. The children of God, God promises, you're my child, you are not alone, and I can use any situation for your good and for my glory. Now, you and I may look at that, and I know, humanly speaking, I say, well, there's a lot of situations that have happened in my life that I did not see a good outcome. But you and I are not seeing what God sees. You don't know who's touched by the story that you have. I think about my dad passing away of cancer a number of years ago, and humanly speaking, I think my dad could have done a lot more good by being alive. But I'm looking through my lens now. I don't know what God did on the day of his service, or what God did in the hospital, or what God did in that nurse or that doctor that my dad was able to reach. I don't know what God did through the testimony of our family going through trial and seeing my dad pass away, and then both my brother-in-laws pass away around the same time. 16 months I became the patriarch of the family, right? I became the oldest living male in the Fountain Zeke Inslee world. Well, not Inslee. My brother-in-law's dad is still alive. But anyway, all of that took place. And here's what happened. I remember our family just going through wondering, God, why? And humanly speaking, I would say, man, God, this just doesn't make sense. But spiritually speaking, and faith in God says, but God, I will trust you. In this situation, Esther and Mordecai, they could have been like, God, this doesn't make sense. But the fact of the matter is that just because a situation doesn't make sense to me or you does not negate the fact that God sees all and can work in any situation. So my question for you today, my friend, is what situation is there in your life where you've been saying, God, this just doesn't make sense? Today, would you pray and would you ask him, Lord, help me once again to believe that you can work all things together for good to those who are saved and to those who love you and walk with you. Lord, help me once again to understand that you are always working, even when I can't see the end. And may we today choose to see life through his lens, that God is always working, rather than through our lens of selfishness and pride and what we want. Hope that'd be a help to you. We'll see you tomorrow as we pick up in Esther chapter number 9, and then the next day, chapter 10, and we will wrap up the book of Esther.